Another question on the resurrection. Dear Dr. Craig, my question was regarding myth growth rates, and if you had ever considered the remarkable growth of myth around Alexander the Great and the lifetime of his contemporaries. And he goes on to quote A.N. Sherwin-White, who we get a lot of research from, that mythological development was a long process in the ancient world and by ancient standards. Yet this questioner is saying Alexander the Great and the mythological development in his lifetime seems to mitigate against A.N. Sherwin-White's research that it takes a long period of time.
Well, let's clarify exactly what A.N. Sherwin-White said. What Sherwin-White says in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, is that these mythical tendencies, or the tendencies for oral tradition to corrupt, cannot wipe out the hard core of historical facts within, say, 2 generations after the event. That you can still recover a historical core even within 2 generations despite these mythologizing tendencies. So he isn't denying that the tendencies are there and operative. On the contrary, he says the writings of Herodotus, for example, are just filled with legendary stories. They have all sorts of fabulous tales that Herodotus passes on, but nevertheless, he says Herodotus is still able to get at the facts about the war that he narrates and is still able to get back to the historical core. And I think the case of Alexander the Great is a wonderful illustration of this. The earliest biographies that we have of Alexander the Great come about 400 years after the death of Alexander, and yet historians still regard them as largely trustworthy accounts of Alexander's life. The fabulous legends about Alexander the Great don't begin to arise until after these 2 authors have written their biographies.
What is interesting about this questioner here who wrote to you, Dr. Craig, is that he seems pretty convinced that there is no mythological development in the resurrection, between the resurrection event and when the documents about it went down in the New Testament. He seems convinced, doesn't seem to have become a Christian or embraced faith in Christ, but he does find it convincing that there was no room for mythological development between the resurrection, the life of Christ, and the resurrection and so on, and when the first documents went down.
Well, again, I want to be careful about how we state this because I think it's been misunderstood. The point that Sherwin-White makes is not that there's no mythological or legendary development, but that it is not to such an extent that the hard core of historical facts is obliterated. And that's why in my research or my case for the resurrection, I focus on the historical core of these narratives, that a group of women, for example, discovered Jesus' tomb empty on the first day of the week after his crucifixion. But the names of the women, the times of their visit, the details of the narrative are part of the secondary and circumstantial features of the narrative, and I don't claim to be able to show their historical credibility. It's the core of the narrative that I think you can show as plausibly historical, and which most scholars today do regard as representing a genuine historical core to the narrative.
So we don't need to misuse A.N. Sherwin-White. And his name has come up in a lot of Christian apologetics books, in defense of the resurrection, defense of the New Testament, and so on. So we want to make sure that we not misuse his data.
That's correct. And by the same token, to not offer facile criticisms of him, as I have also seen done on the internet, where, for example, it's pointed out the number of fanciful and legendary tales that Herodotus does pass on. A.N. Sherwin-White appeals to Herodotus as a case study for the rapidity with which these legendary tales accumulate. And he says what the tests show is that even 2 generations is too short a time span for these mythological tendencies to wipe out the hardcore of historical facts. And pointing to legends and fanciful tales in Herodotus does nothing to negate the point that Sherwin-White is making. Quite the contrary. Sherwin-White is saying, here is a very unreliable author who loves to narrate these mythological stories, loves to hand on these legendary tales, and yet, even with him, we're still able to reconstruct with confidence the historical core of what happened in the war that he relates.